Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's New, What's Next 2020 edition. Thank you all for joining for today's discussion on the singular magic of American-made product and time-honored American craftsmanship. My name is Grace Bewley-Hunt, Home and Design Editor at Luxe Interiors and Design Magazine, and I'm so honored to be moderating with today's talented group of creatives. In our increasingly competitive global economy and with today's culture of instant gratification, preserving and uplifting traditional handicraft here in the United States feels like a more vital pursuit than ever. I'm so excited to dive into this topic, but before we begin, let me first introduce our panelists. Today, we are joined by Douglas Levine, Design Director at the Bright Group. Doug started his career in the fabric sample room at Holly Hunt, and after a brief interlude with a local interiors firm, he returned as Director of Design at the tender age of 24. After later leaving to launch his own business, Bright Chair approached Doug to assist in re-imaging the Bright product line and its graphic presentation. This original ask encompassed designing several new lines, editing existing product, and renovating the Chicago and New York showrooms. So what was intended to be a several-year consultation has continued for almost 25 years and grown to include the opening of new locations in Boston and Dallas and the introduction of scores of gorgeous original designs. The Bright collections are offered to the trade through showrooms throughout the United States and in Canada and England. Next, we have Joseph Jupe of Joseph Jupe, Inc. Born and raised in Michigan, Joseph's early training came as a furniture maker apprentice for a trio of master craftsmen in Detroit. He studied architecture before earning a fine arts degree in furniture design. Joseph's talent is a rare combination of designer, engineer, and craftsman, all of which led to founding his namesake company in Grand Rapids. For years, Joseph has developed numerous modern furniture designs for his infamous Joseph Jupe collection. Seen as a world-class manufacturer with impeccable craftsmanship and attention to detail, Joseph has partnered with numerous industry titans to produce their private label creations. Always collaborative, Joseph continues to build his personal relationships with the very best interior designers and architects, producing exquisite made-to-measure furniture sold through first class to the trade showrooms around the world. And last but not least, please welcome John Pomp, founder of John Pomp Studios, a glass-centric furniture and lighting company. John began his journey to master craftsman early in life while watching his father work as a carpenter. Soon after, he was introduced to glass blowing through a mentor he studied with for many years, and from there on, he was determined to dedicate his life to this passion. After studying the ancient art of Venetian glass blowing by maestros from Murano, Italy, Pomp spent 10 years in New York, where he gained notoriety with his artfully crafted, hand-blown glass tabletop collections. John's work exemplifies the purity of natural materials while embracing their inherent elemental qualities, yielding a simple, organic, modern aesthetic. Each piece is meticulously crafted by hand in his multidisciplinary studios in Philadelphia. So all of this is to say, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better group to speak on today's topic, American craftsmanship. Beyond being linked by their passion for design, these three share another common thread. They're all voices behind the Bright Group. Doug, of course, as design director, and Joseph and John as brand partners. So for those less familiar, Bright has been making fine, traditionally crafted furniture in America for over 90 years. And today, it represents 21 independently owned and operated American companies, in addition, of course, to producing their own iconic in-house designs. In other words, a Bright Group showroom is quite literally a celebration of American design. So welcome, gentlemen, and welcome to today's chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grace.
Thanks.
So kind of to get started today, I think this idea of collaboration is actually a really nice place to kick off. So there's this kind of antiquated notion of the craftsman as this hermetic figure, right? Kind of toiling away in solitude. But you know, this is something we look at a lot at Luxe and we champion really passionately. And what we found, especially in recent years, is this wonderful sense of collaboration between peers and craft, and really this kind of help me, help you mentality. So I think that, you know, your partnerships and your friendships that have grown out of that really speak to that. So I was kind of hoping to kind of take it back to the beginning and hear about your meet cutes, if you will. You know, how did you find one another? What has building that partnership been like? I don't know if Doug, you want to get started?
Well, I think with a lot, for me, you know, I'm constantly looking and seeing and going and shopping and, you know, anything that visually stimulates me, and my fascination with, you know, luxury home furnishings. And so when I run across something and it really was a similar situation with both of these gentlemen, having clients, you know, doing the occasional interior, my love-hate relationship with the design world. I love doing it and I hate all the paperwork. But when as I'm shopping and going and looking, you know, I come across these products and things I've never seen, and I always love when I see something I've never seen. And Joe, which goes back, God, Joe, I don't know, I think it's way over 20 years, 25, almost close to 25 years or something. I saw his product in a small showroom in Chicago. I'd never seen it before, and I just fell in love with it. And I knew that this is something that I would use on my own projects, and that I coveted myself. And then he just sort of approached, and, you know, quietly approached him about coming and joining us, which at that time, the Bright Group wasn't even the Bright Group. It was a small showroom that really just represented our furniture and a couple of lines, but we needed things. I felt like I wanted to grow this to have every part and component that you would ever need for a home, of the best that was out there, that you didn't have to, that would not compete with each other. And I saw and met Joe, and it was just immediate understanding of each other and easy alignment with our aesthetics as too. They were just perfect for each other, and it just grew from there. And then, you know, time sort of passed, and we parted paths, and then we came back together again. And we knew that, but we've always remained friends. Every design market, every city, every place you happen to be, we always find each other, and just, you know, even to sit down and talk before we sort of came back around together. So when we came back for the second time, it was definitely known because we've had such, you know, good respect and friendship for each other. And then John, you know, his product was across the street, you know, across the hallway in a showroom from ours. And I'd walk by and I'd see it, and it was just so beautiful. And, you know, just the quality of this glass and this hand blown, and just the technique, and just how it would just capture your eye as you walk by. And I'm just like, we have to have this. And, you know, you have to do things carefully and correctly. And it just kind of worked out. And John and I would say we had a moment of a bumpy start when we first met each other. And then, but immediately I think we just hit this great bond, and we saw how well our products all work together, and how it sort of, you know, the lighting, you know, that beautiful fixture that hangs over my furniture and Joe's furniture and other designers in our showroom, it just completed the picture. It was just perfect. And we have an amazing, all of us have an amazing friendship. And at the Bright Group, the most important part is we're lucky to create things that are beautiful, and it has to be a family, and it has to be enjoyable. It doesn't mean that siblings can't argue, but it really is. It's about the people and the personalities as much as it is about our products, because then it does sit harmoniously, and it creates a beautiful family atmosphere.
Absolutely. Are there ever moments where, you know, besides Zoom at the moment, you're ever all together in the same place? Like, what would that instance be?
Oh yeah, it's usually at markets, because we're in many different places across the country. And so every market, but when you think about it, it's many times a year. We see each other more than we see even some family members. And the first thing you do is you run up and you hug each other and you give each other a kiss, and then you immediately start gossiping. I'm sorry, what?
What about when I ran into you in LA on the street corner? We didn't even know. I'm like, Doug.
Didn't even know, yes. Well, I think we all find ourselves in the same kinds of locations all around the world. I've run into people we work with everywhere. And that's the great thing, because, you know, we all have the same drive, and we all want to see certain things and eat at certain restaurants and go to certain hotels or certain places. So we do run into each other many, many places. But yeah, so.
Definitely. Joseph and John, is there anything you'd like to add there, kind of in the spirit of collaboration?
Well, you know, first of all, I mean, you know, working with Doug as a designer, but also someone who curates showrooms is a very unique opportunity, you know, because Doug has a couple different angles there, right? I mean, he's looking at product for the showrooms, but also, you know, working with him as a designer, I can tell you, like, when I design products, I design them as a creator. And, you generally have these concepts and thoughts about what you think a creation should look like. But then when you're working with someone like Doug and other clients, that collaborative experience really, to me, just kind of broadens your horizons a bit, because,
Sure.
a designer like Doug will see something and modify it and change it the way, and we do a lot of our products that way. And so it's really great to be able to kind of see someone else's vision in your own products. So maybe a little bit differently than you may not have seen it in the past. So it's a really great experience.
Definitely. Yeah. And I was wondering if we could actually rewind even a little bit further than you guys meeting each other and forming these partnerships. You've all kind of separately expressed that your craft is really innate. It's a passion first, profit second kind of setup, and you're very lucky in that regard. But I was curious. We talked to lots of different disciplines in design. What was it about home goods furnishings that was kind of so appealing? Was there like a hook, line, and sinker moment where it became super clear, or was it more of this kind of long process of realizing where you were meant to be? I'd love to start with you, Joseph.
It was a long process, but for me, I was just a very, very lucky individual, because I found my passion and my skills at a very early age. I'm the youngest of six in my family, and everybody's extremely talented in my family, most of them in the arts, in the music scenes. And so, as I was coming up, everybody was kind of asking me, like, so what do you do now? So I wasn't quite sure. I was fortunate enough to have, and I think this is a great story, because there's not a lot of wonderful stories about the public school system, right? And so I went and I was in an industrial arts program when I was in the 6th grade. And all the kids were making little desk sets or maybe little rings or something out of aluminum. And I had a great teacher, and for some reason he saw something in me that I had not known. And I made a desk and entered it into the state fair. And, I think just that idea and kind of just backing into the craft of it. So that was where my first start was. And then from there, I really needed to kind of, figure out what I was going to do with that. So I studied for, worked as an apprentice for many, many years going to college. And, I was hooked, and of course getting, I think that designing and developing, pieces that you try to perfect and doing it at the level that we're all doing it in, we're very, very lucky, because there are a few people that can follow their passion and make a living at it. And so I don't take that lightly. We're very lucky folks, for sure.
Definitely. So you're all designers. You all, of course, share the same instinct to create, but you work in very different formats and different mediums. And I'm always so interested to hear the creative process from person to person. Kind of, again, from like nebulous, like idea in your mind, like paint chip, mood board, I don't know what it is, to seeing something come to fruition and in somebody's beautiful home. So I would love to kind of, again, talk through that creative process. Maybe John, we can start with you, and feel free to use a particular piece as a case study if you'd like.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my creative process. I mean, my background is a studio artist. So I'm a glassblower of 20 some odd years, but I think I've been saying that for many years. So
Imagine.
a lot. But a lot of my my work is about the process. So there's really, like, I keep a studio arts practice. I have my own art studio. So I'm constantly a lot of experimental works, a lot of experimenting and playing around with the material. There's a constant dialogue. So, I have an enormous library of glass that we have in my art studio here, with hundreds and hundreds of pieces of glass spanning a few decades.
Amazing.
Dare I say. I kind of use it as a visual library, depending on how myself and the design team, I have a small design team here, and we're always kind of putting together different drawings. And sometimes the work will come out in a couple different ways. It might derive from a specific art direction that, we're thinking about, right? And sometimes it's coming from the actual pieces that we're referencing. But right now, I've kind of come full circle in my career, being a mid-career artist. I'm kind of going back to where I began in my, how I fell in love with glass. And I'm hoping that the work that I'm making now, which is really kind of liquid furniture, essentially, is being expressed through all of my love and passion for how I got into it to begin with, is just the love of molten glass. When I was really young, I was fortunate enough to take a glass blowing course. My high school art teacher recommended that he got me through into a really great art school after I put a great portfolio together. And he was like, I was having him help pick out my schedule. And he's like, oh, you should try glass making. And he had done it. He was a multimedia sculptor. And I was like, nah, I kind of just want to paint, to be honest with you. I just want to make art. I really wasn't into craft, despite this is a craft segment. But I went into the glass shop, and I which is a foreign place, fire, everything is just completely foreign. You go in there, and I touched molten glass for the first 5 minutes, and it was magic. And I literally devoted my whole life to blowing glass. I was like, this is all I want to do for the rest of my life. And I didn't know how or why, but I just knew that material made a lot of sense to me, and reflected a lot of my interests in skateboarding and now surfing. And so a lot of the work that I do now is kind of coming really full circle to fluidity and molten glass is a fluid. So anyhow, that's a lot how my pieces are derived right now.
That was your hook, line, and sinker moment. And
that's how it all started. But I think, what I'll say is that, I think it's very similar probably to Joe and anybody else. After we kind of start with some art direction and look at some samples, we go and make a lot of glass. I throw a lot of glass away. We do a lot of drawing. I throw those away, and we do more. And, and eventually we kind of like zero in, but we make foam models, scaled models in the metal shop, and make glass. And then once we get all the glass samples together, we eventually commit to like full scale models, and we try to see it in 3 dimensions in person and start to really understand scale. But that's a little bit about my creative process condensed.
Amazing. I love this vision of you just kind of walking into your like library of glass and having some amazing thought. And I'm loving also all these stories of, your formative years in your lower schools, really kind of being the thing that ignited your passion. And that's kind of a nice segue into our next question, which is really getting at this idea of American made. I know this is a subject very near and dear to all of our hearts, and there are countless pros to championing American design, right? There's a sustainability piece, there's the feeding back to your local economy, but kind of beyond those super pragmatic, reasons to buy American and celebrate American. I'd love to know, in each of your words, what really excites you? Like, what's the edge? Why is American made the best? Like, what do you love about the model? Doug, do you want to start?
Sure. For me, the relationship between all the people it takes to create a piece, whether it's, starting with a little tiny sketch that I may create because of a need, usually out of a need for a client or something. That's kind of how things tend to start working with me now, because as a business instead of just as an artist toiling away in a private studio. I have usually a need to do so, but it comes from from the client, their home, to me, to my sketchbook, to my assistant, to the into the computer, and then it goes through so many different hands of craftsmen and woodworkers and upholsterers, and even when I'm doing something where if I'm collaborating with John or Joe, and we've collaborated on pieces in the past too, it's so fulfilling. And then how fulfilling it is once it gets into the hands of all the workers and everybody it takes and touches to finally gets to the client. Because you have all the craftsmen, you have the salespeople, you have the, and it even affects the owners of of the buildings where the showrooms are and the shippers and how many people's lives it touches and enhances getting to the end. And then, of course, the most rewarding is hoping that you create something like, for me, would be someone's most favorite chair. You know, we all have our favorite chair we want to go to or sit in. And for me to have that, and then to see that then passed down. So it's just how many people it touches, and especially, you know, coming from the United States, that it's being created and landed and employing literally hundreds of people by the end of the day, you know, before it even reaches the client's home. It is most satisfying.
Definitely. Joseph, is there anything you'd like to add there?
You know, I think for me, it's evolved a lot over the years. You know, when I first started, I thought, okay, yeah, I'm going to be a designer. I'll start a business. You know, the idea of, you know, when I started in Grand Rapids, there was probably a good maybe dozen furniture companies here still in town. Grand Rapids has quite a heritage of residential furniture makers, and as well as some of the larger contract people as well. And to be honest with you, you know, as I was starting a business, they were all leaving. And, you know, we're probably one of the last. In fact, there's probably two of us, us and Kindle, who are still in Grand Rapids making furniture in Michigan, or at least in West Michigan for sure. And so, you know, that DNA that becomes a part of you is such an important aspect of kind of passing the torch. You know, and we're at a point now, I think we're really in an inflection point and saying, hey, look, in our industry, this can't be the last generation of people that are developing and designing craft product in America. And so I think there's a pride to it. And I think just, you know, even what Doug said, you need to talk about all the people that he touched upon. I think that was my evolution, was realizing that when I started a company, I did it for myself. Now I know that this company is more than me. It's not really about me. It's about all the craftspeople that are here that work. And so you take a different level of pride. You know, it's kind of cool. You go, okay, yeah, I love that design I just did. But in the end, it's like, wow, we employed American people. We employed people. And honestly, the collaborative spirit that only can be done at the level that we're all doing it, and interacting and interfacing with our clients, really needs to be done here locally. When I say locally, I mean the United States. So yeah, it's a real rewarding experience.
1000%. John, is there anything you'd like to add as well?
Yeah, you know, I can speak to that a little bit as well, Joe. You know, based on what Joe was saying too, like my father, I'm from Western Pennsylvania. My father was a carpenter, steel worker, and he built a lot of useful things around my home, built everything in my home, built me toys. And I think for me, you know, kind of being able to kind of connect the dots of like, I love making things with my hands because I grew up around that, and it made a lot of sense to me. And adding a very influential person in my life, and just an art teacher in high school, a little creativity to that, and for my life to kind of culminate and progress to being able to find a passion and a business and a livelihood of something that I really love to do is a privilege. And now I think about you know, all the people that are part of our team here. And, you know, I used to teach at Tyler School of Art, which is part of Temple University. And you know, I taught in the glass program, and I have a strong connection here in Philadelphia. We have a connection. We have maybe 6 major art schools here. And so, which is really incredible. And part of why I relocated from New York City back to Philadelphia is because of that. And we have a really strong arts and crafts community here, and I'm really proud to be part of that, and to have a place where people can learn, share, work together, and have a livelihood. And it's pretty amazing to be able to kind of share that with my the younger generation, and teach. You know, we're all learning and sharing to teach how to make things. So it's pretty cool in that regards. But one thing I'll say about design, though, that I'm also really excited about in this country, about American design, is that you know, it's a young design culture. So I love that. And there are no rules. And I love that, you know, there's so much, you know, we're known around the world for all, you know, creating in ingenuity, and I think that design is part of that as well. We don't have an old world history and a culture of, you know, that Europe has. And I think you know, there's pros and cons to that, but I have to say that it's a blessing to have, like, to be able to create our future and to not be constrained by history. So I love that in part of design. It's really important to me and inspirational to me.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I was actually just talking about this on another one of my panels, but I agree. I think design is getting, you know, people are getting interested at younger and younger ages. I have 15-year-old cousins who are in quarantine and like thinking about designing their bedrooms. I think there's just such a hunger for new, fresh design. And, you know, that's kind of also what I wanted to talk to you guys about in wrapping up today, just in terms of course, the pieces you all create are these beautiful heirlooms, and there's this idea of passing down as being really integral to this, you know, American craftsmanship. But beyond that, it's really handing down these kind of time-honored crafts themselves, fine woodworking, glass blowing, like keeping these alive in our landscape today. So kind of my question to you all is really, what can we do as consumers and lovers of design to kind of like keep this lineage alive? What needs a shakeup? Where do we need to be investing? Kind of how do you see this just like thriving?
Well, I think it's all about education. And that's education from inside our facilities, Joe and Bright, and how we are passing down the crafts. And then it comes to the products, to the showrooms, to the salespeople, to the interior designers, and telling our stories to them. And I hope the interior designers and sharing those stories to the end users is critical about being able to like respect and honor what we all do. And it's qualitative. And, you know, it's really important that we continue to educate and share what we all do. And I think that's one way to possibly make that happen.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think we're also going to have to really dig deep about adapting to our changing world, whether it's in design or, you know, how people are purchasing goods and obviously new generations coming up and understanding what quality is. And I think that this notion that John mentioned about education, we do as an industry, it needed to develop a way to tell our stories, right? And, you know, look, there's been a lot of products designed and built before we all came around, right? And one could argue that nobody needs to build another chair. And I've always argued, yes, you do, you know, because there's always a need for new and fresh. And so I think we all, in order to keep this business alive, we must pass the torch, if you will, and get people excited about our industry. And I agree, Grace, you mentioned people are getting more and more excited about design than ever before. We live in a design-centric world, and you know, it's far more intuitive than it's been, you know, as when we were growing up as kids. So
Yeah.
I think it's fantastic, and we just got to continue to adapt and get people to understand who we are and what we do.
1000%. Doug, is there anything you'd like to add in closing?
Yeah, I didn't even know that you could be a designer of furniture. It never occurred to me. No one ever pointed it out. I mean, where I come from in a farm town in Southern Illinois, there were no design magazines. There was nobody doing any of this. And there was nobody to guide me. You know, when I went to the counselor and I said I want to be a fashion designer, they looked at me and thought I was crazy because I didn't want to be an accountant. And so it was an accident, you know, going and, you know, then, you know, I have a love of architecture, studying architecture, and then realizing that I didn't really like the technical side of architecture. I wanted to create something three-dimensional. It wasn't until I landed in this luxury showroom business with Holly Hunt that I could design furniture. And then I realized that the piece of furniture was a piece of architecture, which is what I studied. And it was a complex piece of architecture, but something that we get to really live in and sit in and enjoy. But I think I would have had a faster track to that if I would have known that this was even available. And there were not a lot of, didn't know of any schools that taught furniture design. And it was really an accident that happened. But it's interesting now, because when I run into people, they talk about, oh, I want to be a furniture designer. They hear you are, and they're like, oh my God, I would love to do this. I didn't realize people have such a passion for things that we live with. And people slowly are thinking about that this is something that we can do. But I think the education is really, really important, and letting them know, even at the lowest, and not the lowest levels, but the early levels of schooling, that it's not just about, football and basketball, but it's also about, what we can create, and, within the systems, and then everybody making sure that these resources are out there. And it is a hard one to do, because they always think of it as a luxury or not a real profession or something like that, which it is not. And but it's a huge world industry. If you think about how many chairs do we each have in our house, how many light fixtures do we each have in our house? Well, they're all designed by someone, and we all need them. And so let's celebrate it. And and the good thing is it is more aware now, because of media, social media, that magazines, everything that you do for us really does help get the word out. And for one, we need it. And but yeah, I guess that's it. Education, I agree, is the most important part of just letting people know that it's a whole world that is waiting for them.
1000%. And I feel like we could talk about access to education for a very long time here today. Unfortunately, I have to wrap things up. But before we go, just as a fun little send-off, I wanted to play rapid fire Q&A. So we're going to go around the Zoom room. Doug, you're up first. When I'm 90 years old, you'll find me.
Oh my God. Let's see, when I'm 90 years old, you'll find me. I'll probably be sitting in a coffee shop still with my sketchbook, fantasizing about my next house, creating something. If anybody who knows me, that's where they know to find me. I'm not sitting in a bar. I'm sitting in a coffee shop, and I'm have the world moving past me, around me, but I'm in my own little tiny zone, creating my little minute sketches. That's probably where I'm going.
Love it. Joseph, the one thing every home needs is blank.
Oh, another piece of Joseph Jupe furniture.
Okay.
Always the salesman. No, books. You cannot have too many books.
Nice.
Education.
And John, take it home. Words to live by.
Oh, words to live by. Take risks and just do it.
Fabulous. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to this fantastic crew of panelists. From the comforts of your homes, I hope you all take advantage of this terrific What's New, What's Next programming, and we'll hope to see you next time.
It began, like a lot of things, with a phone call. My colleague, Marlene Newman, who I knew 30 years prior in graduate school, we had shared a class together, a drawing class. The teacher was named Flora Natapov. She was one of those miracle teachers that pulled the scales off your eyes and taught you to see living order. It is really powerful. It changed the way I thought about architecture, in fact.
Kelly and I knew each other from graduate school at Harvard. And I was on the search and screen committee, and I told them that I had 2 candidates who would be really good if they wanted a world-class program. And we had taken these seminal drawing classes together, and that's how we met.
So Marlene called and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm teaching at Columbia." She said, "You need to think about applying to Indiana University. There's a new program that was 9 years ago, and it was called the IU Center for Art and Design, to be located here in the city of Columbus, Indiana." And I remember saying, or thinking, Indiana, where is that?
If there were ever a place in the world where there should be an architecture school or program, it's here. And I don't think there's any other program that could rival the assets that are here.
The city of Columbus put $1 million into this process here, into this program. And, you know, from a political perspective, you know, you take a little bit of a risk when you make that kind of a commitment, and you're hopeful that the taxpayers follow. And they have. They think they've embraced what we've done here. They understand the value to the community.
You know, Mr. Miller always used to say the process is more important than the product, because we don't know what we're going to be working on together in the future, what challenges we'll actually experience, but nothing is more important than the way we treat one another in the process of working towards solutions, and that's what the process had always been about.
There's just such a sense of community and collaboration, and a sense that the community almost thinks as one.
I recall walking across the plaza of the library where the Henry Moore sculpture is, in the First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen, and I.M. Pace Library on my left, and it was at twilight. It was in the fall. When the light is low enough with the setting sun that the lights inside buildings come on, and you get two forms of light. And looking, as I walked across the plaza, my heart skipped a beat. I felt hope. Incredibly powerful thing to make you think that what was the best and most possible thing that could be invented with human endeavor and human energy was embedded into the DNA of the city. This is some strong medicine for an architecture program, so that students feel that they can invent boldly and think with their communities, and that a community will respect what they're thinking about. This is a wonderful thing. So that was an early impression I had with this program.
Because it's a brand new program, the people that we are getting are risk takers.
We have like a really interesting group of students who are risk takers.
We probably use this word too much, but certainly risk takers. We say this a lot because the program is new.
I think we were told we're brave. We're all risk takers for being here. And, like, we didn't know what classes we'd be taking prior to this semester, like right before.
It's a situation that calls for all of us to step forward and really articulate to ourselves first, and then to the community what we want out of an architecture education.
The students that come are PhD, we have people with masters, we have people with different age groups, and the collective they produce is eclectic and wonderful because they don't share the same mindset. And you want sparks in your program. You don't want fire, but you want sparks.
Yeah, I find them to be incredibly driven and vocal group. I mean, just ready to let you have it in a way, good or bad. I really like that. I mean, they have chutzpah. They're able to challenge you as much as you're challenging them, and that friction makes for, I think, a good environment for creative education.
I had been employed at a number of schools on the East Coast where I'm from. Each of these schools that I taught at, these Ivy League programs, what I noticed over many years of being there is that the ability to think for yourself and to invent meaningfully for something you personally believe deeply in, there was less room for that. A clever person would learn to separate the method of how they get taught from its principle. And those that could do that could take that principle and learn to then think for themselves. And very few people actually learn to take classes that are ground for them by their professors off and look for themselves like that. The opportunity I had here for setting this program up was the idea that if you could wed artistic inquiry and architectural inquiry to each other again, that they may be able to find belief in how they think visually and the meaning with which visual ideas are produced and created and felt to inform the way in which they think about architecture, and vice versa, to let those two things mix with each other. And drawing, freehand particular, allows unscripted linkages between those things.
My role as an artist teaching graduate students in architecture who know they're coming to a program that's going to require a focus on fine art. It's a whole new type of problem and type of student, and we're not requiring a portfolio for entrance. So most graduate students in, say, fine arts, they come in, they've got chops. You know, it's the graduate level is about concept. Here, we're sort of 30% of the class has no exposure whatsoever in those kinds of thinking beyond their 1 or 2 classes in undergraduate. And so after a whole year of drawing very intensely, because this is 5-hour studios twice a week of drawing, and it seems like a little outrageous at first until you do it for 2 semesters and you see people who came in not being able to really do anything more than a stick figure are taking on full-on projects of, you know, light, color, atmosphere, you know, very complex drawing problems, and they're like, I didn't know that this was available to me.
What happens when you're working digitally? You tend to have to make a big commitment to that thing, answer, yeah. And then so you put in a lot of time. Whereas if you're doing it by hand, it's really quick. You don't have to answer very many questions in order to get to some kind of idea of where you need to go.
We have the students go out into these remarkable buildings and with a sketchbook and no measuring tool, and we say, draw the plan accurately. And look at, like, how am I supposed to do that without a measuring tool? You pace yourself across the floor and count your footsteps. You walk 15 steps that way and 5 that way, what do you got? You got a 1-to-3 proportion. Can you draw a 1-to-3 proportion rectangle? You go, of course you can. Well, that's how you started. And with practice, you get remarkably accurate. So we go to all these buildings and once you draw all their plans and their sections, their elevations, and some drawings from perspectives, you can then say, what can we say about this building because of what I drew? And what you find, because you draw, which slows down the process of looking and makes you ingest what you're looking at. You see things you would have never saw if you pick up a camera. I'm fine to tell them, you pick up a camera, you put your eye out.
One of our projects last semester was to take the plans of the library here and build it build those plans, go in there, 3D render the entire thing, model the library, which is designed by IMP. And the first session I spent working on those plans, I think it was 8 hours straight. And I was like, that's it, I gotta go to yoga, which is right over there. I parked my car and I got my mat and I was in my own head, and then I turned and there was the library. But when I saw it, there was this crazy feeling of just this creative possibility.
Invention comes from convention, that the better you understand something and analyze the heck out of it, with ringing it, almost rubbing it till it screams, but you've analyzed it so much, you know it so well, now it's easier to invent from it. It'll help you, because it all goes into these, call them saddlebags. We got art saddlebag, one side, architecture saddlebag the other, and then when you go to design, you pull stuff out of those saddlebags to design with, and the way they come out of your saddlebag isn't the way you put them in, because it mixes with something that belongs to your own personality, your own nature.
People say, wow, Indiana University, the School of Architecture, School of Design at Indiana University's really accomplished a lot. The community's accomplished a lot. We don't see things as being accomplished. We see things as beginnings. There are a whole lot of us, and I think a whole lot of people included in this school, that think there are much greater things to come.
I believe in the power of the individual imagination, private conscientiousness about ideas and belief, and where to find meaning and how we build our environments is essential to being human. We hope to build a program that makes a culture for that grow and thrive, in a city that wants it, in a university that wants it, and in individuals who believe in it. I want to be able to give the student of architecture the opportunity to have a shot at their own genius. Not everyone has it, but you have the right to have the opportunity to pursue this. And so this is what I think we're trying to do.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm really excited to have Peg and Kelly both together here. The story that you took us through, the journey that you take your students through, I'd really like to get deeper into that. You know, one of the things right away that came up was this theme around risk and risk taking. And I thought that was very interesting. You know, at a professional level, there's some sort of risk mitigation that can be tied to architecture in a way. And here you guys are right away pushing the boundaries.
Absolutely. I can jump on that one. Kelly can complement my answer, I'm sure, with this more specific story of the MArch. But I mean, that's a story of the school generally, I think. So the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design was founded in 2016 under originally the name the School of Art and Design. Then we added architecture, lengthened the name, and then we had the naming gift from the Eskenazis that ended up lengthening our name even more. And the fact that we founded the school really meant that we were attracting faculty and even myself to this concept of a new school, which is not very common in higher education today. And we really were able to recruit faculty and students who were interested in this idea of a new way of looking at art and design, architecture, merchandising, education. And then that really absolutely came to be true when we founded the architecture, probably twofold, because it was a new school and a new program, Master of Architecture, within our new school. So we had sort of a double whammy there of people that were really excited by this concept of being a part of something, the founding of something, the formation, the foundation setting. And it takes a certain kind of person who wants that sense of risk. And that's definitely been true of the faculty that we've hired. They're all very excited to be working toward the goal of foundation, not just carrying something forward that has been in existence for 50 years, but really the work that it takes to form something new. And then that's true of our students as well. Kelly might want to talk about how wonderful the first few classes have been of students that have really grabbed onto this idea of helping us form the school.
Thank you, Peg. Let me first thank you for this interview. And second, I'm going to reiterate something the dean said, is that her attraction to the program was no different than mine, coming from the East Coast, where I had been ensconced in graduate programs for 30 some years, because there was an opportunity to invent something that could touch on original themes. You had a city that believed in that enterprise. You had a university and a president and a provost that were on board with this idea. And you had a concept waiting to be formed to bring something new to the table. And this is what brought me out. And I think the echo of that goes right through why the faculty have come, why our dean came, and the kind of student that showed up in our first, we have 3 cohorts now. In the first cohort, we didn't know what kind of person this was until they walked in the door. And it took a while before we realized, and it was really Marlene Newman, who teaches in our program as our associate director, who coined the phrase, "These guys are all risk takers." And because she sensed, as we all sensed, that we were an unaccredited, we're unaccredited, we're on the accreditation pathway. The program in itself and its concept is startlingly different than any other program we think in the United States, in the way in which it couples artistic inquiry with architectural inquiry by having these twin studios that you teach parallel to each other. And the student that was attracted to this had choices with other programs, but in the end selected this principally because they were interested in this novel, this idea about education. Then it was, there's a major university and an entire city
behind this particular idea. And I think, and then they felt they were going to have a chance to help form what this program becomes too. And I think that was a very powerful part of it.
Okay, let's talk about the blend of art and architecture and what you're creating here. And let's get into the various reasons why this connection is important.
The point of asking an architectural program to invest this much in the way in which we see, think, feel, and understand has a lot to do with the fact that many ideas that are in architecture are what are called visual ideas. They aren't very well expressed by words in the least, but they're hard to express, but they're understandable in the way in which we see and feel and sense things. The act of learning to draw and learning to understand color, learning to paint, and learning to also cultivate order from disorder, and the act of using your hand and your arm, which we've been hardwired for thousands of years of our brain, is kind of linked to our hand in such an intrinsic way that complex things done with the hand help the mind think and imagine. And this is being verified by science work, as the brain's the last organ in our bodies, in our biology, that is not well understood by the sciences, but they're making these inroads. And what we learned in a symposium called Drawing in the Brain we had several years back was that the hand and the brain are so well linked to each other. In fact, when a brain is born, it starts looking for a hand. And if it doesn't find one, it makes one, which describes this intrinsic reciprocity between mind and act when you draw and think. So learning to use the act of perception and drawing increases your visual understanding. It deepens your involvement and connection to the things in the world. And more importantly, it connects to something that's very deep inside. To reconcile yourself against a concept or anything outside of yourself, you need a means of mediation and connection that's unscripted. And drawing, something like drawing, provides that very means. Why that's important to a young architect is that they're trying to formulate ideas and concepts about the forms and shapes they're going to use in their buildings, so they have a sense of belief in that these forms and shapes and their combinations hold meaningfulness that must reside within themselves as much as they are able to sense these are important in my community that I work for. Most architectural educations are set in a system that is much like the old ateliers, that you learn from people, you listen to their principles, but mostly their methods, and you learn to work under the command and the ideas of the people that are teaching you. I participated in those programs for 20 plus years on the East Coast, knowing full well that how a student came to invent was largely through learning the language, the meaning, and the forms generated by the school and sort of gifted to the student. We're interested in students being able to participate in the larger conversation of architecture in this state, in this country, and on this globe, but we want to give them an opportunity to discover for themselves an individual voice with the opportunity to find an original connection to something. So by learning two disciplines that are not the same, art and architecture actually have separate, they aspire to different conclusions for different reasons. Do not mistake a piece of art for a piece of architecture. There is a reason they're different, but they're close enough that they cause a spark to occur. And so the idea was, do these things in parallel for 3 years, and you will find somewhere where those spark across and make a link for you that belong to you. They don't belong to me or the people teaching you. You found it, and that becomes the foundation of your own voice. And that's really what the program is designed around. We have a beautiful city with an incredible laboratory of experimentation on civic structures that sponsor architectural structures and urban structures. We have a university that's a monster of a university in its research capacity and its knowledge base. And we have a beautiful state of natural beauty down here in the south part of Indiana to relate to. These are all wonderful, it's like a chemistry, shaking that stuff up and watching what happens.
I'll just add quickly that I think a big differentiator for the program is the fact that it is within a School of Art, Architecture, and Design. It's not a separate School of Architecture like so many other universities are organized, that, you know, take apart art is over here and architecture is over here, and they don't really talk to one another. We have combined these things into one, and so that synergy is expressed in the organization and structure of the school itself. And that helps to reinforce what Kelly's saying.
You know, I just wonder if art not only impacts how you perform as an architect, but also how you experience space. I'm drawing on that specific experience, Kelly, that you had on the IU campus. I can even imagine myself there as I watch your video. Does art play a role in that? And I guess in turn, does art play that same role in so many other professions?
I think all my colleagues from the East Coast, where I come from, would probably feel many of the same things I feel walking through across that space. And also, there's a deep emotional undercurrent in all the people studying architecture everywhere. This is, you can't exercise that out. I said the role of art in our program is to is part of the area is the power of cross-pollination, to help the agency of human imagination, to aid it, to help it, to advance it, to cause it. But learning why spaces speak to us, and like anything, what differentiates this kind of work from, say, passive entertainment, like watching a movie, is that a little bit of knowledge and how to scratch at it, to open the avalanche of meaning that's in there, is necessary. This is true of art, it's true of architecture. We live amongst our buildings and we use them. They're functional. They have to solve the rational problems of living. And so often that'll, in people's minds, camouflage or hide or not reveal the thing we think about the most when we're designing, which is how does this space or room or this assembly of spaces, exterior, interior, help augment this particular ritual of life called eating with the family, or where we meet strangers in our home and how we greet them. And how does a house accept that in the way that's very different than how you let your family and friends in through the back door. So the functional issues of architecture may overshadow that. We think of buildings as normal stuff, but in fact, they're not normal. They say other things, but you have to learn to read it a bit to be able to discover the wealth of ideas that are there, that designers and artists over many thousands of years in cultures all over the world have patiently and assiduously poured into their buildings and streets.
I think one of the things that Kelly and his faculty do with the students in architecture by training them in this twin studio way is they're teaching them complementary ways to see. And I think in the visual studies studio and architectural studies studio, they're learning to see and learning to create in ways that they're different. They're different, but they're very extremely complementary, and they cross-pollinate, as Kelly says. So, I mean, I see that in all the classes in the school, that it is about training the students to be sensitive in different ways, and to really truly look. You know, our life is much about just walking about without really seeing, just like we don't listen very well a lot of the time either. So this education is about making sure that the senses are just fully trained and aware, and then you can use those in your work.
This cross-pollinating idea is actually, it's embedded in the school, the way that we set up the school, and Peg started us on the path of inventing a curriculum and recharting the way in which Indiana University is going to embrace the problem of teaching design. This is exactly what we did. We began thinking about how to structure the curriculum so that there's impingements and that one thing can rub off on the other, and so you grow a broader array of knowledge sets. You know, it's very important to learn more than one discipline. I mean, architects tend to be people that are unhappy with learning the ideas of just one discipline. They like to have a whole bunch like this.
You know, I would just love to project back or project forward. You know, what if 50 years ago, every architecture program had this blend of art? What would our places and spaces look like today? Or if we projected forward, you know, what if we did this for the next 50 years? What would things begin to look like then?
It's hard to know what the future, no one can predict the future. I can talk about the past. And I wanted to say earlier that one of the things you learn when you learn about the visual inquiry that comes with studying the second dimension, or we also do bas relief, and there's a little bit of sculpture going on here too. But when you pursue artistic inquiry in the studio, there's a lot of implicit things that are embedded that make meaning. And they're often mixed together, they become metaphor, they're suggestive, they're not explicit. And yet architecture is also rational. So you're being forced to work with both halves of your mind a lot to find those, the way those combinations would actually link with each other, right? But I wanted to say that some of there are these implicit things, or some that are not rational that we pursue as designers. And the art side of our program helps address that. In the past, there are programs that attempted this. The Bauhaus was famous for taking the hierarchy, craftsmen at the bottom, fine painters at the top, and they leveled it to make them all equated to each other. There would be no hierarchy between those, which was the thought of allowing more cross-pollination to occur. The Bauhaus lasted some 14 years before a guy named Hitler showed up and scattered all those folks to the winds. Some landed in the United States, some went to other parts of Europe. And so another program, particularly in the United States, like the Bauhaus, didn't exist because they were fitting into schools already established by the French model that came from the École des Beaux-Arts. Which is why this opportunity was so rare. Here's this major university, a city committed to an investigation of this type to build a new kind of program that would allow an experiment as bold as the Bauhaus. Before Bauhaus, I will use the example of the Renaissance. Many of these cats never studied architecture. Nobody went to architecture school. They were frankly artists. They came up in the guilds. And many were in their 40s pressed into the service of doing buildings for their clients. They didn't necessarily want to do them, they had to do them. Sangallo was one of the few that said, I just want to be an architect, and I just be one of those things. I have to do the other stuff. I could paraphrase. And of course, historian's going to have a field day with me on that. But and so it was years walking around Rome, where I taught that city for many years and still do, that I began to question the nature of my own education. And why is it that these buildings exhibited such tremendous inventiveness from their forebears? And what did they know? And why all these cats were doing multiple things. You know, Bernini had a workshop that engineering, architecture, vestments for the Pope. He wrote an opera. He painted, sculpted, was mostly known for as a brilliant model or solid form. What did he know that somehow how come we can't cross and touch those things too? It didn't bother him. Because they're one-off geniuses. Maybe this is the answer, but almost everybody had a practice that was multi-pronged like this. And I can't not to think that this is a great aid to your imaginative faculties in your thinking.
Absolutely. We're returning, all things old are new again. I mean, we're returning to earlier thoughts, but these are so important. And I think at this time, we're realizing that connection between things is as important as the actual sort of siloed discipline, that the connections, the glue that exists, the cross-pollination, the reflection, the synergy, that those things are just as important to learn. And you need time to do that. It takes time, takes focus. And you need to construct a curriculum that allows for that. So it has to be very intentionally done. And I think what we're seeing is an enrichment of our students, of the education, of our faculty, and their experience. They love collaborating and cross-pollinating with one another. It allows everyone to continue to grow and learn. And I think one of the goals, I know Kelly has spoken about this a lot, one of our goals is that each of our students who graduate from the architecture program are unique, that they're not cookie cutter, formulaic, that they are approaching problems uniquely, solving problems uniquely, and creating work that is unique. And that comes out of, I think, this combination of art and architecture.
It is the ability to craft your own identity rather than having one assumed for you. We're told, put on this jacket if you want to be this thing.
Well, I think it's very special work. I'd say that you're both risk takers, and I can't wait to see how these students come out and shape our world. Thank you guys. I really appreciate you sharing your insights and your thoughts. It's really important work.
I have a fantastic group of panelists here to tell us about how we can rethink our approaches to air and water in order for us to clean, protect, and share essential resources, even as we fight against climate change. We have with us today Josh Greenfield, who's the Director of High Performance Design at HDR. Josh, thank you so much for joining us. Maria Perez, who's Senior Associate and Director of Sustainable Design at Gensler. Maria, such a pleasure to have you with us today. We have Luke Leung, who is Director of Sustainable Engineering at SOM. Hi, Luke. And we also have Nathan Stratola, who is the Chief Engineer at the International Well Building Institute, IWBI, which of course are the creators of the WELL standard. Thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us today. I'd love to start today's discussion with Josh. Josh, you're spearheading energy modeling at HDR. Tell us about how energy performance, which is one of the first priorities really when we talk, for most people, when we talk about high performance buildings or sustainability, how that intersects with air. How does it intersect with ventilation, heating, cooling, and what are the new opportunities and efficiencies we have possible there?
For sure, for sure. Well, thanks. First, thanks for having me today on this panel. It's a great opportunity to be with some like-minded folks and hear some great questions. You're right. So there is a direct correlation as ventilation conditioning is one of the highest end uses for a wide variety of building typologies. And currently it's a tug of war between increasing or decreasing ventilation depending on how 2020 is impacting your region. So the pandemic is calling for more direct outside air in lieu of building recirculation, but not all regions can support this. So, you know, like the West Coast is calling for more building recirculation in order to prevent smoke and toxin byproducts from the wildfires from entering the occupied space. So going back to increased ventilation, you know, a lot of people are led to believe that an increased ventilation leads to an increase in operational energy. And the role of energy modeling is to, you know, is to go through that and provide alternatives. One of the biggest efficiency opportunities for me in a building is building recovery. You know, we always talk about renewable energy, but what about building energy, renewable energy? Early in a project, I always like to do a waste stream heat balance of any project. And at this point, I'm looking at what are we rejecting into the atmosphere, whether in air or water, that has a heat that we can recover. And especially early on in the project, nothing is off the table and has to be looked at from kind of a blue sky perspective. So recapturing the waste heat, even if it's low grade heat, has the potential to be utilized in many ways, specifically in the process of ventilation air dehumidification. So there's a balance between finding that appropriate technology to combat the additional temperature conditioning and the humidification requirements. from the increase in outside air, such as, you could use regenerative dehumidification, liquid desiccant, air conditioning, thermal gradient headers. But at the same time, you have to look at, is that air being delivered to the space clean? So you're looking at technologies such as high efficiency filtration, ultraviolet lights, certain variations of bipolar ionization, or even biomimicry-based filtration. But every building's unique. And while one technology or control solution might work on one building in one particular region, that doesn't necessarily apply to a reasonably similar building in a different region or environmental condition. It's that whole every building's a snowflake kind of mentality. But the data from energy modeling can be provided to the design team to aid the design making process. So we're here to inform. And in my opinion, the power of that data is the key to energy modeling. And the data itself is the efficiency that is always progressing along, as we have available software, like you're going to see today with the Cove tool sets, and as well as advancements with scripting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, right? How can we use energy modeling to inspire new ways of thinking about air and water? Your point is well taken, right? We have to look first to efficiencies that we can create within the building itself. Yep. We have, in the United States, in general, put ourselves on a path where we're reliant on HVAC. We are reliant on air conditioning as a way of regulating air in our buildings. But there are ways to make that, to optimize those systems. There are ways to bring down the energy use of the systems, but also to make the air cleaner and so on through that early energy modeling. So I think that's key there. And regardless of, as you said, where you are, the models might be different, but the process of modeling remains important, right? And the answers might be different, but the input remains really important. So thank you so much for that, Josh. Luke, I'd love to bring you in here. You sit on ASHRAE's Environmental Health Committee. If you had to pick an engineering priority that would make the biggest difference to air quality and environmental health, especially given that we're dealing with multiple challenges to air quality and environmental health at this point. Vivian laid out, particulates, microbials, as well as chemistry of the building itself as barriers. What would be those engineering priorities? What processes or what perspectives should we go to first to sort of make sure that we're creating a healthy building?
Okay, I'm gonna paint a little background first before I answer the question. So the year 2019, United Nations World Health Organization come up with 10 things that's gonna derail us. Number 1, climate change. Number 2, chronic diseases. Number 3, pandemic. That's 2019. Of course, 1 year later, we know the damage of pandemic. Which one of us designed a building for chronic diseases? Climate change, we know that. Now, there's a common denominator on that, and Vivian verbalized that, is particles, right? So if that's the kind of the threats coming, right? Are we as a race ready? Are we? So let me tell you this. Today we have 7.8 billion people. 13% is about 60 years old. What happened if pandemic hit us 50 years later? We will have 9.4 billion people in 2070, 28%, almost double the percentage today. It's going to be about 60. It will be a different world, and we're going to hit hard by that because simply we have much more vulnerable people older than 60. What do we need to do? 2 things. The number 1 thing is actually not focus on the built environment. We got to seek the peace of the terrestrial health. Unless that has peace, we're not going to get built environment very peaceful. Why do I say that? Why do I say that? Have I been drinking something different than tea in my lunchtime? No, I haven't do that. Here's why. Just look at desertification. Turning forest to desert. In the last 7,000 years, about 375 to 550 gigatons of carbon coming from desertification result alone. That is the entire budget of the fossil fuel consumption human beings ever deliver. And also, if you look at Ed Masria and his carbon positive talk, from now to 2040 or 2050, 340 gigatons or 550 gigatons, that is the entire budget for our carbon from now till 2050. So the point is, nature is important. Now, if you can actually avoid that, you can actually deliver more diversity of microbial, because that's plants coming to have diverse microbial, and also reduce the PM 2.5, because desert in all the area around the world tend to deliver more PM 2.5. And the good news there is, in the last 20 years, the world is doing that. You look at China and India, they are contributing to more green area in the last 20 years, as reported by NASA, because of those two countries. In China, they actually turn a desert, 93% of a desert, 42,000 square kilometer into Greenland, and actually develop the lungs of the world bigger. So that's number one. And number two is the built environment, which I think we'll talk more today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Luke. Thanks also for that corrective, right? I mean, I understand, right? As we are talking about optimizing the buildings we're designing now, which is where Josh started us off, I think we have to look at that bigger picture. So thank you for reminding us of that. It's really, really important. I do want to point out that the things that the building industry does, not just architects and designers, of course, but the building industry in general, of which we play a small part, but an influential part. The things the building industry does contribute to that deforestation. It does contribute to environmental degradation. And that's why things like the materials pledge or responsible specification practices do become important, because they send signals both to policymakers and to markets that, you know, we have to move the needle on the kind of materials or the kind of resource extraction that we're a part of as an industry. But, you know, to your point, I think that's very well taken. We have to look at the larger environmental conditions if we do want to address that. One small thing I want to point out for anybody who was with us yesterday and is joining us today. Yesterday, Joshua Gassman from Lord Sargent started us off saying we have to think of a 150-year life of any building that we build today, right? We have to think about durable, flexible, loose-fit buildings so that we're not back in the position that previous generations have now put us in, you know, where we are doing adaptive reuse of existing building stock to make it, you know, up to standards. I'd like to put that against the changing demographics that Luke just pointed out. You know, as you're thinking of that 70-year life, 100-year life, 150-year life of the building you're designing today, you have to understand those larger demographic changes that Luke pointed out. We are going to be looking at more and more vulnerable populations, you know, a more vulnerable humanity over that 50-year period, and we have to design to that. So Luke, there's so much in what you just laid out here. So thank you so much for that. There's a lot of interesting threads we're going to pick back up. Nathan, I'd like to bring you in on this. You know, of course, sitting as you do at the IWBI, you have an inside view of, you know, a whole bunch of bright minds, including the COVID-19 task force that IWBI just constituted, who are working on measures to make our buildings healthier. You've just worked through some revisions to the well building standard, and some of those specifically relate to air and water, which is what we're discussing today. Can you talk about some of those changes that you've made to the standard and why you've made them?
Sure, Avi. So this spring, we were at the point of graduating our Well V2 pilot and into the formal Well V2 when the pandemic really started spreading throughout the world. So we decided that it was time to constitute this COVID-19 task force to present our strategies and any others to groups of experts to see if there were anything else we needed to introduce. And we found that a lot of what we have included in WELL for some time is also beneficial under certain circumstances. It often was included for different reasons, but is equally beneficial, such as increasing ventilation rate has been something that we've promoted, or having direct exhaust from bathrooms. So there was a lot that we had, I would say, almost inadvertently done right because for other purposes, but probably the biggest change was regarding filtration. We had promoted filtration of particles from outdoor air, which is good when you're worried about traffic and wildfires. We had promoted filtration of carbon filters for VOCs from indoor air, since particles are the primary source, or emissions from furnishings are the primary source for that, and looked at applying UV to cooling coils because they can get damp and grow mold. But what we determined was that what we were missing was looking at the spread of infectious diseases. So we've modified one of the features there to also look at primarily looking at 100% outdoor air, so that avoiding recirculation completely, of course, encouraging proper energy exchange, as Josh brought up, but that if air is not air is recirculated, if it's not possible to do 100% outdoor air, treating that not just with carbon filters for the VOCs, but also with a method to target infectious particles, either from having a sufficiently rated media filter to remove the particles, or by having induct designed UV systems that target the particles of the moving air. We also found that there were some changes in other topics, such as we had been moving towards more forms of active education rather than just providing resources people could read through. And one large pivot that was spread throughout the standard was we are now promoting more virtual education, because as the world of remote work and remote yoga classes has brought up, those are equally working. But I would say the talk about the recirculated air is the largest change that we made regarding air and water.
Right. Obviously, at this point of time, indoor environmental quality is, a top priority for most people, especially as they're trying to, not just prepare their existing spaces for a return, but also as they are completing projects at this time that will likely open in a post-pandemic world. I think, as Luke pointed out, infectious diseases and chronic diseases are, only going to be on the rise, and we have to reimagine our building systems to do that. In the meantime, however, changing the standards on our existing building systems is really important as well. I'd like to remind everyone in our audience that we are open for questions throughout today's discussion. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A tab. We'll start taking audience questions pretty soon. Anything is fair game, and no question is too large or too small. So please go ahead and put them in the Q&A tab. Also, we are upvoting questions today. So if you see a question that you'd like answered, please hit the thumbs up icon below the question and we'll take those questions first. It's been an amazing discussion so far. We have focused a lot on air, which is completely understandable given the situation we're all in today. Maria, I'd like to bring you in here on the bigger picture. What are some of those big picture approaches, larger design philosophies that you think will allow us to retool our approaches to air and water in the way that we need to? We've spoken about, current technological or data-driven tools, such as energy modeling. We've spoken about building systems-based solutions, as Nathan did, talking about air changes, talking about filtration. And Luke pointed us out, of course, to the bigger picture in terms of dealing with the larger environmental changes and making sure we take those into account as we're designing for the future. So what are the design approaches that are going to answer that challenge? I know you're a big proponent of biomimicry, biophilia, and bioclimatic design, all of which connect to air and water in some way or the other. So Maria, if you can talk to us a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Sure. So I think that what I'm advocate of those three principles of design, because I think we need to become nature. Nature is solving all these issues, and we are right now learning a lot from nature. So when we're thinking about biomimicry, there is a lot of innovation in biomimicry. Looking at nature for inspiration and see what nature has done. We have to imitate nature in a way that if we can function like a tree, all of our problems are solved. So that's kind of the biggest challenge. And biophilia is that connection with nature, right? Being able to connect the dots and being able to understand more about our environment. And bioclimatic, all of the buildings in the world look the same. So if you're in New York, the buildings look the same in New York, they did that in New Mexico, they did that in California. So bioclimatic has to do with the place, the climate conditions, and the making those buildings more available to the people in the site, and being able to find materials also and resources that make them more regionally. It's a more regionally sourced design instead of all the buildings looking the same everywhere. So this bio-inspired design approach is being something that is being talked a lot, but I think the time has come to start talking about these issues for now more than ever, because nature is going to help us solve these challenges. And as we understand more about this bio-inspired design and what are the technologies that we're going to be looking to all of this, the solutions are there. And it's just a matter of us starting to looking for those solutions. Another thing, when I'm thinking about those three items, I'm thinking about natural ventilated buildings. I grew up with no conditioned space. In my home, we opened the windows, and it was very well designed, so you were able to survive. Now we come to a sense that we don't pay attention to anything that is around us, because everything is conditioned space. I remember I went to school, and the only rooms that had condition, it was the classrooms. Everything else was open. Now we condition every single space. So start to think more about what are the areas that we can think about, that we can start from the inside out instead of condition everything else, and then start thinking more about naturally ventilated buildings. I know some of the challenges could be humidity. And when we think about humidity, we say, well, it's very humid, therefore we have to condition 100% of the spaces. Yes, it's very humid, but you still can do a lot for opening the windows and being able to have access to outdoors. So I think it's just trying to shift your mind a little bit and understanding more how to design with nature in mind, and being able to put nature at the table. When we're thinking about team members, we always say, well, we have the engineers, we have the architect, we have everybody in the table, but who's representing nature? Who's going to be responsible for us to give something back and being able to put nature at the center of everything we do and have more restorative design? So I think it's just a lot of thinking, and I think it's a lot of design coming out of those three concepts.
Absolutely. I love that idea of nature as a stakeholder in our design projects. You know, it seems like, you know, one of those exercises that you kind of have to do in order to change the way you think about things. Your point about air conditioning and about ventilation is well taken. I'm sure, you know, we can have Josh and Luke come in on that, you know, further down the line for sure. Recently, there's been a great a book that has come out called Design Before Air Conditioning, which is looking at how modernists, even as they were dealing with the aftermaths of you know, their own pandemic, which was of course the 1918 Spanish flu, had started to think about natural ventilation strategies and ways of working with you know, solar adaptive design. You know, some of that knowledge has been lost as we've, you know, relied so much on air conditioning. One last note on air conditioning, I think everybody in the audience, on the panel and in the audience, knows perhaps the drawdown review, the project drawdown and the drawdown review that came out recently this year as an update. Both have pointed to refrigerants as the #1 area for us to reduce our environmental impact. And of course, refrigerants are integral to HVAC systems. So, you know, reducing our reliance on HVAC seems to be something we do have to move forward with. And I know all of you on the panel have worked on natural ventilation in some way or the other, so I'm sure we're going to hear more about it. A quick reminder again to everyone, we are taking questions throughout. We already see some great questions on the docket here, so we'll turn to those in a minute. Before we do that, I'm wondering if we can take up that question about natural or passive ventilation. And I'd love to have Josh and Luke come in on this. And then Nathan, to your question about, bringing in outdoor, I'd love to have you comment as well. Right now on the West Coast, we see the immediate problem with natural ventilation, right? As Josh said right at the beginning, in certain places, people are looking for reduced ventilation from the outside, not increased ventilation with the outside, because of course, high particulate matter levels. We know now that at least for the time being, it seems like every year around September, we're going to have a series of wildfires on the West Coast, and it's going to make it impossible for people to open their windows. So even while we acknowledge natural ventilation as the wisest and the most energy nature accorded solution possible, we understand there are some immediate term challenges. So how do we adjust our thinking? I mean, it's for a while it seemed like the answer was natural ventilation, but now we know that there's probably that may not be a one-size-fits-all solution either. Josh and Luke, I'm wondering if you want to comment on that.
Who do you want to go first?
Well, you spoke up first, Luke, so you get it first, and then we'll bring Josh in.
Okay. So yeah, natural ventilation is good if number one is thermally acceptable. Oh, by the way, there's exciting things going on. The adaptive comfort portion of S-Ray, if some of you are S-Ray people, they're gonna have a new version of adaptive comfort come out for mixed mode building. So I know I took a detour, sorry. But natural ventilation is good if it's thermally acceptable and quality-wise, the air quality-wise is acceptable, right? Now, when natural ventilation is not acceptable for either one of those reasons, having closed the window and turn on the AC is not an issue. I know there's discussion about, do we need to go 100% outside air versus filtering? Let me tell you this, you do not have to go to 100% outside air. Let me quantify that. 100% outside air will give you better quality in terms of the viral load in the building, slightly better. But there's a paper delivered by Professor Brent Stevens in 2013. He studied all these things, different cities in US, 100% outside air versus MERV 13 versus MERV 14 versus HEPA filter. And what he find out is because MERV 13 will continue to filter the air throughout the day. So if you take the whole day as a duration, it's actually start approaching the performance of 100% outside air, though 100% outside air still performs a little bit better in terms of COVID-2, in terms of SARS-CoV-2, the virus. So the good news here is if you have a MERV 13 filter or above, it's actually a very good place to be. It definitely turned that corner on the J curve in terms of viral load elimination and approaching 100% outside air. So it's not the end of the world if you have to do that.
Right. So Maria, that's good news. 100% outside air is still the best thing to do. But if you can't do it, it's not the end of the world quite yet. There's stops along the way. Josh, can you comment on that? What are your thoughts on natural passive versus air conditioning?
Yeah, I definitely can, and I'm in 100% agreement with Luke. I think if you have the opportunity to passively or naturally ventilate, if the air is of quality, you should. I'm a big controls proponent and less giving control to the human occupant of the building who can not always respond to control set points. So I'm a big fan of having an automated natural ventilation system that can utilize the data and best bring in the air at the right times. Now, from a reduction of outside air standpoint, again, complete agreement with Luke, and as I know design teams and building facility owners are being swarmed with different technologies available to combat, to make cleaner air. And I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but there's no magic solution. All the strategies do have pros, but they definitely all have cons. As we know, high efficiency filtration adds static pressure, which is going to increase your fans and your horsepowers. Bipolar ionization, which is a technology that's being floated around by a lot, And again, there's so many different variations in these technology, these components. So like for one, for bipolar ionization, that requires additional cleaning routines because a lot of those particles get very heavy and fall to the floor. And if they're not being vacuumed up or cleaned up, a lot of those are going to sit there if they don't make it back to the filtration system. It also generates additional carbon dioxide and ozone, which is a big greenhouse gas no-go for that. And ultraviolet lights can break down the wildfire toxins, but it can't remove the particulate matter from the wildfire smoke. And sometimes you can have an unpleasant odor in the space. And then biowalls, well, I'm a big proponent of biomimicry filtration walls, but there's no standard for them yet, unless there's no performance testing standard for them. So anything that you'll see is fairly, testing research-based. You'll see that in a lot of universities, which is great to see, but I would love to see that design area progress to actually have control and tested data. But I think the biggest thing to adjust is we just have to know that there's many variations of this equipment, know the different manufacturers you're getting involved with, and look at the data. And then kind of move forward with the path of least resistance.
Right. I'm sorry, I can't resist. Just one last sort of perspective there. I understand, right? I mean, there's no perfect solution. Josh, anybody who says that is always the most popular person in the room, right? Like everybody's looking for answers. I mean, of course, all answers are flawed at this point. So thanks so much for taking us there. But Maria, I want to come back to having heard what Josh and Luke said. I just want to come back to you for a second. Just like you, I grew up in a passive ventilated, a naturally ventilated home, as I'm sure many people did. And after 10 years in New York, I definitely want the heating on, at least in the winter, right? So our bodies change. Our perception of temperature and comfort changes. You were talking about a mental shift. Is there also a mental shift that we can be working? Is there scope for designers to influence that mental shift or that cultural shift in terms of us starting to take passive measures like, putting on a sweater at home, or at the office in response to heating and cooling methods? Talk to us about the cultural shift that you'd like to see as well.
Yeah, the cultural shift that I'm thinking, it has to do with behavior, right? We tend to design to the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is a man with a suit that has 2 or 3 layers. And then it comes a lady with a dress and it's like, I'm so cold in this office. So you have the opposite in an office space. And we tend to always design in the United States for the worst case scenario. We don't want anybody to feel discomfort inside the building. But I don't see anything wrong with having 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 days out of the year in which people feel a little hot or a little cold. I think it's that perception that the spaces have to be perfect and everything has to be to the worst case scenario. When I say mind shift, it's like, why do we have to have everything so perfect and the temperature has to be at 65 or 72 degrees always? And the reason why I'm saying mental shift is because we're not used to that. We're not used to any discomfort. We want to always be in a perfect environment that nothing is wrong. But at the same time, we are having to think about more about all the energy we're having. Like if you go to an office building, you have the lobby, it's been air conditioning. You pass the lobby, 5 seconds? And in 5 seconds, you're not going to feel hot or cold. You're just passing through. Trying to be more smart about which space is really going to make an impact, and having those perfect environments when you work, when you go to school, the classrooms, and the environments that you're just passing through, that you're not having to spend a whole lot of time in those environments. They're not considered to be regularly occupied spaces. Those areas can be designed different with the different factors. So I think it's just the mindset of always having to condition 100% of all the spaces to the worst case scenario, and being able to understand, why do the stairs have to be conditioned? You're just going up or going down. Do you really need to put condition, or do you really need to condition the stairs? The same goes for circulation areas. So there is a lot of things that we are thinking they always have to be perfect. So the mental shift has to do with cultural, and the fact that we always want to have the perfect environment everywhere we go, even if we're passing through for 5 seconds.
Thank you so much for laying that out. I think that's really important. We have to hold our minds open to the possibility that we can't just always have buildings change to the things that we want. We have to also sometimes change our mindset and our behaviors as we occupy and inhabit buildings. I have a question here from Jean Allen from the audience, and Nathan, maybe you want to get in on this first, and then maybe we can bring Josh in. Jean Allen asks, how can we retrofit our existing buildings and do it affordably? Filtration can be difficult to upgrade. OA can be difficult to increase within the context of existing systems, so outside air. Are there effective alternatives to energy modeling, especially for smaller commercial interiors projects? Talk to us a little bit, Nathan, about how you thought about the size of project and the investment that would be needed in making your recommendations. And then Josh, if there's any insights there on energy modeling for smaller projects versus larger commercial projects.
Sure. Then to chime in a little bit on the modeling, we are promoting modeling a lot within WELL, both for daylight modeling, lighting modeling, thermal modeling, and we sometimes hear that it's expensive, but one of the things that the developers and designers need to keep in mind is that it is a cost, but it's seen as a soft cost often, but compared to installing the wrong lights, compared to installing the wrong system, it's actually quite cheap. So that's something to keep in mind as part of that. I think that one of the important things is always to analyze your existing system that's there, to work with some professionals to understand it. And again, that involves hiring engineers or other professionals. There is going to be some cost that's part of that, but oftentimes that's understanding that your system may be in better shape than you thought. One of the things with like COVID-19 is we're talking about increasing ventilation, and projects are saying, oh, I'm an existing building, I can't change it. But a lot of them are finding that once they actually look at that, they're like, oh, okay, I can increase this by 15%, or I can go and install this type of filter here in these areas, and my system can affect it. Some areas can't. Some projects are old, or their ventilation systems are already struggling, but that just knowing that, analyzing it again to see what the system can, and then you might be able to work with it. And then also in the cases that you can't, it is possible to look at some standalone air purifiers that have a lot of these technologies built in, the UV and the particle filters or the carbon filters. Often those are sized for relatively small areas. So in larger projects, you'll need quite a few of them to make a difference, but in smaller projects, they might be good solutions.
Great. Josh, anything on the energy modeling part of that? Nathan already commented a little bit, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Nathan. There's professionals to help you out, even in those small scale projects. And, you know, those could even be through the utility. A lot of local utilities have great programs to offer for retro commissioning, climate resiliency, or even just have a general, you know, pandemic assessment. A lot of packaged systems, yeah, I totally agree. They've got a motor that you know that it can handle a certain size, and they've got a coil that can handle a certain conditioning BTUs. But that's not to say that there's some room for adjustment. You know, as a mechanical designer, I know we design systems with a safety factor. So having that professional come in and do a gap analysis and say, all right, well, I see, you know, these MERV 11 filters, I think you could handle a HEPA filtration system or maybe an activated carbon filtration system. You have that available horsepower, you could do that. Or this system does not have an economizer. So, you know, that's not necessarily a load on the additional on the coil, but it gives you the ability to bring in 100% fresh air. Energy modeling also has the kind of the thought that it's a large scale process and that it has to be extreme using Energy Plus or eQuest, but there's such great platforms available on a smaller scale that can easily allow you to see the alternatives in data format. Case in point, if you stay on later, I know that Cove Tool is doing a demo. And that's a great opportunity to see in a quick time variations that you could run to your commercial interior project to show you the benefit. And then you can associate it with a cost. I know that affordability and financial feasibility is always going to be that factor. So looking at life cycles of these measures, whether it's an existing building or a new building, you know, Avi, my head's still spinning on that 150-year lifespan. I can only imagine doing a life cycle on 150 years, how many times that equipment would have to be replaced.
Well, you know, that's something I brought up as well on that conversation, right? To run a 150-year building, think of the number of not just mechanical equipment replacements, but also interior renovations, and what is the footprint of that. But anyway, we digress. Just a quick reminder to everyone, we're here talking about new approaches to air and water with Nathan Stratola from IWBI, Luke Lung from SOM, Maria Perez from Gensler, and Josh Greenfield from HDR. A special thanks to our sponsors for today's event, Armstrong Ceiling and Wall Solutions, Duravit, Human Scale, and Target. Thank you so much for supporting this conversation and making it possible. We have a question here that's related to, I think, one of Vivian's early comments about moving to non-combustion generated electric power. It is a bit of a digression, but I'd love to take it up. And if Vivian is still around and wants to come back and answer or weigh in, that would be fine too. Daniel Kovac asks, if the future is based on non-combustion generated electrical power, please comment on nuclear power generation from the perspective of less terrestrial disturbance typically required for solar generation. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on electrification. Nathan, do you want to comment on this while we wait to see if Vivian can jump on?
Sure. So prior to my work at IWB, I worked with some solar research, and one of the papers I published in Energy Policy, it was analyzing the capacity and the suitability of solar in different regions. And one factoid that came out of that, as an example, was looking at different power grid areas, and the Potomac Electric Company, which services Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and the surroundings, to generate 7.5% of the annual solar, or the annual electricity of that whole area, so a little under a 12th of the annual total electricity, could be done by installing solar panels between the runways, over the airport terminals, and over the parking lots of the region's 3 airports and Dulles Air Force Base. So it's solar takes up room, but there's plenty of room. There's plenty of disturbed room. There's plenty of developed room that's right there. If I look distracted today during our session, it's because actually we're getting solar installed on the roof of our house in Brooklyn, which is a fairly dense area. But even this, it's estimated to be about 100% of our annual electricity consumption for our house here. So that it takes up a lot of room, but there's a lot of room available.
Right. Vivian, do you want to comment on that, solar versus other?
It is a really tough question. What do we do about nuclear? And if electrification is pervasive, will we need to keep nuclear in the mix? I'm part of a National Academy panel that's looking at carbon neutrality by 2050, and what do we have to do? Deep conservation is absolutely the first thing we have to do. We have to slash our demand by 50%, which we can do. The building sector is 40% of the demand, and if we cut that, we would offer back to society at large 20% of the total energy demand in the country. And you do the same with transportation and industry and agriculture, and we all of a sudden can start to envision a world in which we can live on our own renewable footprint. It's not going to happen by 2050, so we're going to have to keep in the mix a certain amount of, even though I think California has already set a goal that all new construction will be all electric. And because wind and solar are well suited to electrification solutions, I think we're going to end up using a certain amount of natural gas. We're going to lean on the residual nuclear. I don't know if we're going to build new nuclear power plants, and we're definitely going to have to do some form of carbon sequestration, which could actually be in buildings. So I think, the built environment tends to keep itself separate from the power generation. But because the power generation is really there to feed, 40% of it is to feed the built environment, we have to take a more proactive role in becoming alternatives to increased generation demands. And so, yes, I think I don't know, I'd love to see nuclear go away because of the storage issue, not the carbon footprint. But I think for a while, we're going to need to lean on a certain level of both natural gas and nuclear.
Right. Obviously, thank you so much for that, Vivian. And that one point that you made there, we think of ourselves, as separate from the power world. Recently, we've seen a lot of talks about, cogeneration plants even if those make small dents, in energy use, they reduce reliance in small ways on the grid. Every small step counts, and some of those steps may not be so small. Nathan is going to go all solar, which is fantastic. So it is possible. Thank you both so much for your inputs on that. Thanks so much, Vivian, for coming back and kind of speaking on that. We have a few questions in the audience, from the audience here, and we will get to them in just a few minutes. But I'd love to talk a little bit about a question that I've had when it comes to air and water use. In that, Josh, Luke, all of us have broadly been talking about operational air and water use. So air and water use that's in progress, while a building is being used. We're talking about exchanges of air, outdoor air with indoor air and so on. But the upfront, there is an upfront element to water use in a project, and in terms of impacts on the air as well. Construction processes have an impact on air quality. The manufacture of certain building materials, certain plastics, certain products which go into buildings all have impact on air. Maria, I'd love to bring you in on this, and Vivian, maybe you have a thought here as well. How do we start to, as we are doing with carbon, we're thinking about embodied carbon, we're thinking about that upfront carbon now in such a deep way. How do we start thinking about the impact of manufacturing and construction, all that upfront stuff, when it comes to resources like air and water?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're talking about the existing buildings. I mean, I'm trying to understand the operations when we're thinking about existing buildings. Also, what are the impacts on that, or you're talking more about the construction aspects of that?
I'm talking about the construction, the manufacturing of the materials that we specify as architects and designers. Right, okay. All of those things use water. They have impacts on air. So how can we start thinking about those, even as we start thinking about embodied carbon?
So when I'm thinking about materials, I don't know if you heard the word honest materials, what we call it honest. Honest is the same way nature gives it to you. Those are considered to be honest, which means those materials, the same way you take it from nature, you use those without a whole lot of added chemicals, paints, adhesives, whatever. So I think it's a new movement. It's about reusing products and trying to recuperate some of those products that have been used in the past. So when we're thinking about carbon, I think the old, what we say the old is the new. We're trying to understand more about what are the products that have the least environmental impacts. And when we think about those products are the ones that have less ingredients. The less is similar to when you have on a diet and you're looking for the ingredients in the label and you say, oh my gosh, I don't know all these chemicals, but if you get into an organic food label, you see only 3 or 4 components. The same thing is going to happen with the products. The more things added to the product and the more processes added to the product, the higher the environmental carbon footprint is going to be. So I think that a simple rule will be to specify less finishes and less products, and the ones that you specify, focus on the products that are currently existing, that you can recuperate, that you can refurbish and reuse over. And then also think about the products that are considered to be honest, that you can keep, that you use those products without having to add a lot on top of it. So no cover products, like you have the gypsum board wall, but what if you leave more exposed concrete, and trying to figure it out ways to design in a way you leave the wood exposed instead of covering and covering and covering, have layers and layers of products. So I think it's just a rethink, going back to basics, and then being able to understand more about the environmental impact, and we look at the ingredients on the labels. And then of course it has to do with the chemical components on those, the red list that we have heard about. The red list, we want to stay away from those as well. But it's just, it's difficult to navigate because it's a lot of products. The simple solution to this, it will be just to look at the label, and if you see a lot of things in there and they have a lot of chemicals components, you know you're going to have an issue understanding more. Now, the other issue is the labels, right? You have the EPD, the Environmental Product Declaration. So we need to push our teams to look for those labels. It's about transparency. And in order for you to understand which products will have which environmental impact, without those labels, how are you gonna know, right? If you're gonna buy food, if you don't have a label, the same thing happens. You need to know the components in order for you to decide if you're gonna buy it or not. For architects and designers, it's gonna be exactly the same. It's all about labels, and the label that is focused on carbon right now is considered to be the Environmental Product Declaration, the EPD. So the rule number one, look for EPDs everywhere you go, and then understanding how to read those EPD and compare those EPD one versus the other. So I think that's kind of the rule of thumb.
Right, EPDs are the best tool we have now. And day before yesterday, we had a demonstration from Mindful Materials, which is a fantastic platform where you can access EPDs for a whole bunch of different products all in the same place. Vivian, do you want to comment on that, on my question about sort of the manufacturing and construction implications when it comes to clean air and water? And then we can go back to some audience questions here. Vivian, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would like to just echo what Maria said. I do think that we need to actually specify products, knowing with transparency. And we are looking for products where less is more. We're looking for products that have EPD and health and HPDs and declare labels and have actually some form of cradle to cradle analysis, so we know what the environmental impacts are. There is some real innovation that's occurring in the heavy hitters, so that the really heavy materials like concrete and steel and aluminum, because of their energy intensity and their material intensity, tend to be the biggest problem for carbon and the biggest problem for water. And those industries are actually trying to aggressively do a much greater amount of recycled content. In the case of the concrete industry, much lighter structural systems, bubble decks take out, a third of all the material in your structural slabs. And then the possibility of actually embedding carbon in the materials themselves, where you actually encapsulate and essentially take them out of the waste stream, because concrete is pretty inert. It's going to be around for most of your concrete decks are going to be around for hundreds of years. So if rather than having them bury CO2 in the earth or in the ocean, maybe we should start to be a partner to have them bury it in the buildings that we intend to last for 150 years. Just a thought.
Right. Again, returning to that idea of buildings as carbon sinks, we have to get there eventually.
And wood, don't forget wood. So because it's a powerful material.
Right. Absolutely. Wood, of course, sustainably forested. Luke reminded us right at the start that deforestation is an important thing for us in the building industry to keep our eye on. We have a question here from one of our attendees who says, our office works primarily with public schools in an area of the country where climate change is still up for debate for a large percentage of the population. Do you have any advice for low-hanging fruit or low barriers to entry that designers can incorporate into their projects? This is a classic question. Is it possible to be green by stealth? And if so, where would you start? Josh, Luke, do you want to kick us off in terms of how some of those modeling tools or some of those early engineering decisions can maybe sneak in some sustainability or provide clients who are not necessarily moved by the climate change argument, give them other benefits or arguments for doing the right thing?
I'll start this time because Luke started last time. And I just want to add one thing to the last question about the operational water from manufacturing construction. I think access to data is huge. We have great databases, eGrid, about how much a specific power plant utilizes from an energy and a carbon standpoint in a given year. They're mandated to submit. That doesn't exist on the water filtration and the sewage treatment plants. And if that data existed, manufacturers who are very metric-based, man hours, lead times, would have that data, and I think they would really grasp that. So that's something I'd love to see. Low-hanging fruit, man, I wish there was that was super easy in a new building. I think, the good thing about energy codes and standards is they're pushing us along to that point where we essentially are stealthily implementing a lot of these measures, as you put it. Energy codes and standards are updated every 3 years. If you look at the map across the United States, there's still a wide variation what states and what municipalities are following what. But there's a great deal of opportunity within those codes, both beyond code achieving, and whether you're going for your state level energy code, there's also alternative codes such as ASHRAE 189, International Green Construction Code, to bring up and look at a case by case. I think, you know, just having a visioning session and maybe not making it as stealth as possible and just opening up the opportunities to the different end users and the people, you know, making the decisions, and showing them, you know, what is potentially possible. And, you know, like I said, I wish there was that magic low-hanging fruit. But again, I think, you know, we're being pushed along. So I think that we can thank the codes for that low-hanging fruit to get sustainable measures into our projects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Luke, any tips on converting the unconverted?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things we can do as low-hanging fruit. I mean, earlier you mentioned the idea of adaptive comfort and the temperature variation. In terms of school environment, temperature variation oftentimes will bring about cognitive improvement, as in restoration of your cognitive abilities. The long term for it is alesthesia. Variation in the thermal environment can actually be restorative to your brain. And also, oftentimes that brings about delight, the thermal delight, that little book that some of the architects have to read when they go through school, the idea of a thermal delight. So temperature variation is good. It's not a bad thing. So let's get used to that. The idea of natural ventilation, just open the window. The idea of daylighting, and if it's a school environment, have the kids spend more time outdoor. As you know already, like under the sunlight, the SARS-CoV-2 in middle of the day survive about 7 minutes airborne, but indoor, when it's complete darkness, is about 3 hours it can be active in the air. So the idea to get, oh, by the way, and also typical American, 40% is vitamin D deficient, including some of my kids, because they spend their life on the couch playing with the iPhone. So get them outdoor, have them spend some sunlight time. It's good for them. And it's passive and it saves energy too.
Right, right. Maria, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I want to say low-hanging fruit for schools will definitely be daylight, as I completely agree about daylight being a factor for learning. And the other item for water will be specifying low flow fixtures for water. There is a good label, it's called water stands by the EPA. So low-hanging fruit is having the low flow fixtures installed in the project. You don't have to do more than that. Just by performance-based specs, you can accommodate that. The water savings could be done that way. And then I'm thinking about regarding what are the other things that they could do. LED lighting seems to be the way to go. It's a lot of savings on LED lighting. And then again, opening the windows, right, to be able to reduce the amount of air conditioned space that they're using. And very important for schools is the health of those materials. I mean, the healthy materials component, because the kids are gonna get exposed to all of that. So the HPD, the health product declarations, will play a big role because they're gonna be inside the space a lot of times. So we want to understand what type of chemicals they're gonna get exposed every day. So I think by default, if you focus on specifying products that are considered to be low emitting products, you specify low flow fixtures for the toilets and restrooms. You have drinking fountains to allow kids to drink water throughout the day to keep them hydrated, kids to be able to feel healthy and then being able to drink water throughout every day. So it's just that another component on the site, I'm thinking about offering, of course, the kids bike racks and showers for the teachers to be able to encourage people to do more, make the spaces, activate the stairs, make the stairs nice so people can actually use and move around. So there is a lot of things that they could do, but I definitely think the indoor air quality is one of the biggest components, and daylight and having access to operable to be able to assess some of those components on the energy side.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing that up, Maria. You've actually created an opening for me to bring Nathan in here. Nathan, the well building standard, of course, is centered around human health, not necessarily around climate change, even though sustainability is such a important component of the standard. Can you take a minute and just tell us about why focusing on health issues, such as the things that Maria brought up, indoor air quality, access to daylight, things like that, can be a powerful motivator in places where, the big scary climate change argument that may not have much traction?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is seen more immediate, particularly in terms of the bottom line. Like when you're looking at the costs of a building, like it might be 1% is going to be on your energy usage, 10% on rent, and 89% on your salaries, so that you could have free rent and no electricity at all, or if you can get a 10% increase in your productivity in some way, that could overcome that. So people sort of see that in a lot more clearer dollar terms in the short term that is there. So I think that's one reason why that a lot of people are looking to that, but at the same time, we also always are encouraging people to be looking at both. Like we don't want to say only focus on the health of the people inside and ignore everything else. And that's why projects get 5 points for also being certified in a leadership program for energy, like LEED or Green Star or BREEAM. And we've published numerous crosswalks to look where there is an overlap in the program to say, oh, you've already done this in Green Star, therefore that proof of award means that you have an easier job working with WELL. So trying to really say, we don't want to be responsible for rewriting everything that LEED and all of these other programs have done a great job over the last 2 decades putting together, but we want to find ways to be encouraging projects to simultaneously be looking at both concerns.
I'd like to take one last question with all our participants here. We do have a couple of other questions on the docket related to water systems on the planet. But I hope Kelly and Margaret will forgive me if I sidestep that a little bit. If any of the panelists wants to look at the Q&A and maybe wants to hazard a response to one of them, I would be very thankful. But in the meantime, I have a broader question to all of you. One of the reasons we care so much about air and water, one of the reasons why the COVID-19 pandemic has become such a force within the sustainability world, and has really shaken all of us up, is that, clean air and water are fundamental rights. I mean, everybody on this planet should have access to those things. They're important for our biology. They're important for our survival as a species, especially as Luke says, if we're all getting older and unhealthier over the next 50 years, we can use as much clean air and water as we can get. How do you see the work that you're doing today in various fields contributing in some way to that larger goal? How, as architects and designers and engineers, how can we play a role in securing clean air and water for people on this planet? I know that's a big question, but I'd love if you can take a couple of minutes and answer that. In the meantime, we have a question from Monica Aguilar to Maria, asking about the principles of design that you mentioned. Monica, I'll put those in chat to you in just a minute while the participants respond here. So folks, can you take a minute to talk to us about how you think, as architects, designers, engineers, whatever role that you have in our industry, how can you contribute to wider, more equitable access to clean air and water? And everybody's going to answer, so anybody can go first.
I can start thinking about cities and the impact that we have in our cities. I'm thinking about nature again and the green roofs, livable walls, vertical gardens. So I think, in my opinion, when we start thinking more about nature and start covering a lot of more space with nature, protecting and restoring. So the only way we can solve this issue is by restoring all the habitat that we have destroyed. So stop the development of greenfield sites and then take everything we destroyed and restore it back, being able to bring it back to the natural way again. And the only way we can do that is by bringing nature back into our spaces. So more synergy between the human spaces and nature, and then understanding more about synergies between green roofs. A green roof can help not only for the habitat, it can help also with the energy, right? Because the R value and the roof is going to increase, so the energy amount is going to benefit. You also, it's gonna help with flooding because you're gonna retain more water. So the flooding issue, if we were to cover all of the city's roofs with green roof, that would be a fantastic approach. There would be no flooding. However, only Chicago is doing it. I was reading about Chicago, that initiative that they have, and Chicago is the only city that I know is doing it. But if we were to do just a simple solution, green roofs everywhere, you bring in the habitat and you having more nature back into the city. You can solve the issue with the stormwater, solve the issue with flooding. So thinking about the water, the biggest problems that we have. Now, if we start collecting rainwater also will help, because if you collect that rainwater, you're also gonna be able to benefit and everybody will have access to clean water when the time comes. So regarding air, I think it's the same way that we're talking about the naturally ventilated buildings, and we already discussed a lot about that. So it's just a matter of thinking about kinetic architecture. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term kinetic. Buildings that respond to the environment. If the sun is coming, it will be fantastic if we have buildings that can respond to the environment. So if the air is clean, they will open up. If the air is not clean, it will close. So they call it kinetic architecture because it can move and can facilitate that livable, making the buildings more livable, and being able to have technologies that help us move into that future and responsive to nature. That would be my 2 cents on that, on the water issue and the air quality issue.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Maria. Anybody else want to come in? How can we encourage more equitable access to clean air and water through the work that we do?
Yeah, I'll go real quick. So I saw an interesting comment a couple days ago on a post somewhere, and it had to do with California, Oregon, and Washington. And I live in Chicago, but I've got coworkers and friends who live out there, and my heart just aches every single time I see what's going on out there. But as the comment was, what if as much effort into the reduction of plastic straws was put into the reduction of wildfires? Would we be here today? And it's kind of adding on to what Maria said. I think it's shifting the project design goals. We need to get out of that way of thinking where we have code compliance and high LEED rating score buildings, net zero, and we need to move beyond that and get to the restorative, regenerative world. HDR is developing a regenerative framework that we're going to be utilizing on projects, which actually associates metrics to the project, for carbon, water, nutrients, air, biodiversity, social health, and set those goals against comparable metrics. Everyone, design teams seem to be very metric based. So seeing that improvement of how we're entering this this land from a nutrient standpoint, what are the quality of air in a natural metric form, and how are we improving that with our design, I think is what we have to do. It's like you said, it's our fundamental right, and that's, while every single move, while granular, does have an impact. So.
Okay. Nathan, you're going to come in?
Yeah, I would say one of the key things is going to be better public awareness of the efforts that are going in. I do understand that in certain areas you may need to have greenness and by stealth, but that generally making sure people are understanding why it is that we're doing these things. And we require every project to have a feature guide that explains, here are the specific things that this building is doing, and here's why it is, to make sure that the occupants understand these things. And that is good for their own knowledge because it lets them both understand how else they can do this in their life. We have projects that say, oh yes, I've gone and completely changed what I buy at the grocery store because I now work in a well-certified building. It's entirely just that it's rubbing off on them in terms of the mentality. So a similar sort of thing that people can understand this is something that is helpful, that it's not something that necessarily it's going to be they're sacrificing something because of it, but that this is why we're doing the things that we're doing.
Right, absolutely.
I will add on to that. I will say, agree to the prior speaker's opinion about we got to restore the lungs of the earth to clean the air. That's equity for all. And then in individual building, we gotta have passive porous building that can be dynamically open to allow outside air in. But when the times you cannot allow outside air in, from climate change to chronic disease on PM 2.5 to pandemics, you're looking at a spectrum of elements, actually from 0.1 micron to about whatever sizes beyond that, 100 microns and beyond. That spectrum can majority be filtered by a MERV 13 filter or above. And they are relatively low static pressure. It's like 0.2 compared to a MERV 8. So it's completely doable in most of the building. And that can be the highest common multiple to defend us against a whole spectrum of things coming our way. That's on the air side. On the water side, make no sense to me. Sea levels rising, groundwater dropping. Does it make sense to anybody? Why don't we put the water back to the ground where they are short of? There's a good reason for that too, because when you store groundwater, the temperature is lower. The problem about sea level rise is number one, is rising. Number two is thermal expansion of the volume of the water. So if you put it underground in a colder temperature, it actually shrinks. So how do we do that? Now there are countries in this world. For example, we work in many countries in Middle East, China, Asia, Australia. China has a national policy. You must, through the sponge code, put 60 to 95% of the water back to the ground where it belongs. So why don't we do that as a race? Try to put the water back to where it belongs in area that's short of water to avoid some of these issues. So that's a couple of things on air and water.
Thanks, Luke. That's fantastic. You're absolutely right. We have to be recharging groundwater, and that is absolutely vital. Vivian, I'd let you get the last word here.
Oh, thank you. This has been an amazing and really interesting panel. I certainly agree with almost every priority that was said in this wrap up. I do think we need to put more effort on mitigation than on adaptation. So while I would like to put in the right filters for forest fires, I'm desperate to reduce the forest fires. And while we look at pollution in cities, we need to rethink transportation. So anything we can do to slow, turn, and regenerate healthier air and healthier water will be a huge contribution. And I would agree that passive conditioning is a key part of that. We need to treat, there are 8,760 hours in a year. And truthfully, for most cities, 7,500 of those are actually not too uncomfortable and have fresh air. And so we have a lot of time that we've been sealing ourselves off from, as Maria said, because of the worst moment. And we basically say, well, the worst moment is going to dictate the whole year. It's time for us to unwrap that and design mixed mode and adaptive buildings, dynamic buildings that allow us to run on natural air for as long as possible. On the water side, again, we have to mitigate the pollution. We have to mitigate the drought, the falling water tables. We have to mitigate against, you can't really mitigate against storms, but you can capture the storms in a way that absolutely, as Luke was saying, rebuilds the aquifer, meets all of those needs that we're using potable water for, that we could easily be using rainwater and gray water for. And we are so we are so overextended in our potable water demands, as certainly almost all the industrialized nations are over extracting way beyond the carrying capacity of the earth. And so it's time for us to start thinking about those deluge rains as a positive resource. And the architecture is and the urban infrastructure is such an important part. Every linear mile of roadway should become porous or greenways. We need to reverse what the Europeans call soil sealing. We have 85% of American, or of many dense cities, 85% is impervious with no capability to absorb or store. And we can change that through design. So design is a very powerful tool for us to address those three big water challenges and those three big air challenges that I tried to start with.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Vivian. Thank you to all our panelists today. Vivian Lofness from Carnegie Mellon University, Nathan Stodola from IWBI, Luke Lung from SOM, Maria Perez from Gensler, and Josh Greenfield from HDR. Thanks also, of course, to our sponsors today, Armstrong Ceilings and Wall Solutions, Human Scale, Duravit, and Parquet for supporting today's conversation.